Chapter 12. Achilles found Cyrenthia not where he had expected. That expectation being that Cyrus's daughter would be assisting Odysseus with his task. Instead, the hunter discovered the dark-haired woman sitting where she could not see the proceedings, but was far enough away to not be a part of them. Her eyes were, of course, on Odysseus. To ask others would have been unthinkable even to Achilles. Although, as the archer approached, his own keen gaze noticed hers surreptitiously shift to Lilia, then back to the son of Diomedes again. "I brought you some water," he said as a way of interjecting himself into her private world. He offered her the sack he had carried with him, freshly filled at Master Ethan's estate. Ever practical, save when it came to love, Achilles had first paused to gather something to drink before chasing after his friend. Cyrenthia took it with a nod of thanks. She drank far more than Achilles assumed that she would, which meant that she had been sitting out there for quite some time, just watching. Likely Cyrenthia had run all the way here, fearing some imagined danger, whereas he had taken his time, somehow aware that Odysseus was utterly safe. When she was done, he took the sack back and remarked, "It's truly astonishing, isn't it, Sari?" "Yes, it is." "I've been his friend since we were children." Without asking, he took up a place next to her. It was as forward as he dared get. Despite his sometimes gregarious appearance, Achilles was more at home in the forest, alone with his quarry. In social circumstances, he felt only a step above Mendel and, when the woman next to him was concerned, as awkward. His comment took her to look at him with such intensity that Achilles wondered what he had said wrong. Cyrenthia appeared poised to say something, but it was almost a full minute before a single word escaped her lips. And when she did speak, it was not on the subject that he assumed it would be. "Why are the two of you friends, Achilles? You seem so different in so many ways." He had no answer, save, "Because we just are, I guess. We were friends the moment that we met." He shrugged. "Children are like that." "I suppose." Cyrenthia thought of a moment, then asked, "Is she what you would dream of?" Now the subject he had expected was at hand. Cyrenthia had merely taken a more circuitous route to it. "Lilia? She is fair, to be honest, and no man would let his gaze pass over her without noticing that. But the same could be said for others, not merely her." He could barely have been more blunt in his eyes, but she seemed not to understand that he meant her. "I know that to us she is exotic, and I can understand why Odysseus would fall for her, but it was all so quick, Achilles. It can be like that. It had been like that for him, in a sense. One day he had known only Sari, the impish child. The next day, there had stood the beautiful woman. Achilles had been so lost in amazement of the change that, for the next week, he went without a single catch to his credit." Cyrenthia was silent for a time, and Achilles satisfied himself with being in her company, which was how situations generally ended. They watched as Odysseus greeted one Parthian after another. Each time he succeeded in doing whatever it was he did. Achilles noticed both his friend and the one touched shared a look of immense satisfaction. "Is that the way you felt?" he finally dared ask Cyrenthia. "Like them?" "Yes, but the way she said it made the hunter not so certain." "Have you been able to do anything?" This time there was a pause, followed by, I don't know." "How could you?" Her tone grew more adamant. "I don't know." Normally Achilles would have left it at that, but this time he could not. "Sari, what do you mean?" Her gaze shifted not to him, but rather her hands. I feel it, just as I know many of them do, but that's all. I haven't noticed anything else around me. I've tried to think of things, make them happen, but as far as I know, nothing has. Still? I would have thought, but now... Now she looked at him. Her eyes were steely. So would I. Believe me, so would I. It made no sense to him. Lilia had already displayed several instances of ability, making as such flowers and berries bloom on bushes, or healing some minor cuts suffered for one at the moment. She had also summoned a rabbit to them, saving Achilles from having to hunt, but leaving the archer feeling as if somehow the animal had been cheated of its chance to survive. "What about you?" his companion asked without warning. "I haven't seen anything from you either." In truth, Achilles did feel something within him, seeking to grow, but he had done his best to smother it. He had told no one of that decision. Many might desire the gift that Odysseus offered, but not his best friend. Achilles was satisfied with being who he was, a hunter and a simple man. "I suspect that I'm not the best student for Odysseus," he returned. "Not at all. But no one taught him. Not really. With Odysseus it came as sudden as the storm over Sarum, which apparently was caused by him too." Odysseus was pressed on all sides, Sari. He was accused of brutal murder by Brother Achilles. The Inquisitors would have dragged him back off to the cathedral, probably to burn as a fiend. He had no choice. She was not convinced. It was all terrible, but why at that time? Why not when his family slowly and horribly perished from plague? Why not then? Why even him, for that matter? There are so many others who have suffered worse, and yet we've never heard of such an astounding thing before. It would have even reached Sarum, you know that. Even as he nodded his agreement to this argument, Cyrenthia went on. "And why not Mendel then? He suffered as much too. His family was wiped out, and his brother was accused of a terrible crime. It could have been him, but it wasn't. I've seen nothing unusual about Mendel. Have you?" Her mention of Mendel made Achilles flinch. Cyrenthia noticed his reaction, and her eyes narrowed. "What is it, Achilles? What about Mendel? Is he manifesting abilities like his brother?" It was not the suggestion of that which had caused the archer to flinch, but rather a brief and unexpected recollection of another time, another place. As Cyrenthia had spoken of Odysseus' sibling, Achilles had relived the moment when he and his other friend had inspected the mysterious stone near Sarum. Not only had the archer seen again Mendel freeze in place before it, but he had also re-experienced touching it himself, and the awful emptiness that had overwhelmed him until he had managed to pull free. "No," Achilles finally managed. "No, nothing like Odysseus." She was not convinced. "Achilles, what?" Without warning, a tremendous sense of fear overcame the hunter, but not fear for himself. He had the awful feeling that something was happening to Mendel at this very moment. Achilles leaped to his feet, startling his companion. "What is it? What's wrong?" He wanted to answer her, but the urgency he felt was too strong. Without a word, Achilles began running. He ignored Cyrenthea's concerned call after him. But barely out of sight of the woman he loved, Achilles came to a dead stop. The fear for Mendel had not lessened any, but the archer hesitated to begin his run anew. The truth was, Achilles had no idea just where Odysseus' brother had gone. The streets through which Mendel moved were oddly empty, and the buildings around him had suddenly taken on an unsettling gray cast. There was no wind whatsoever, and not the slightest sound. Mendel would have felt very alone, save for one thing. He was still surrounded by the shades of the guards Odysseus had slain. Since their arrival, it had taken monumental effort on his part to keep from screaming out the truth to the others. Either these shadows of men existed, or he had gone mad, or both. Mendel did not know which would be worse. He only knew that he just wanted to tell someone what was happening to him. But he had not. He said nothing, even when they had arrived in Partha, where his hopes that the ghosts would leave him had dissipated the moment the first of the shades had passed through into the town. Until then, Mendel had believed that his haunting would be temporary. Now, he feared that the dead would always be with him. Fear was perhaps no longer the right word. Certainly, they kept him anxious, but the more they were around him, the less frightened he became. They did nothing but stare, not in condemnation, but as if awaiting some word from him. So far, though, Mendel had said little directly to them. He had asked them to please kindly go away, but since they had not obeyed, he had seen no reason to continue any further attempt at conversation. At the moment, they were the least of his concerns. As he continued through the town, Mendel began noticing peculiar signs of age on the buildings, as if Partha were some ancient place long abandoned. The shift became more apparent with each step. The grayness grew darker, veering toward the black. This was not right, he realized. Where was everyone? Where was Odyssean, after whom he had been chasing? Mendel was worried about his brother, especially what the Parthans might do. He recalled too vividly what had happened in Sarum, where people who had known Odyssean all his life had turned on him. But then there arose a sight ahead that made Mendel falter in his steps and forget all about his brother. He spun around with the intention of fleeing, only to find himself facing the very direction he had just abandoned. A direction that led to a long-neglected cemetery. A cemetery that, from its ancient state, surely could not be Partha's. With the shades of dead men already surrounding him, Odyssean's brother could see nothing but ill coming of entering the overgrown burial site. Yet, when he tried to back away, the cemetery only drew nearer. Nevertheless, Mendel tried one more step back, and in the next breath found himself standing within the ruined grounds. A choking sound was all he could muster as he tried to come to grips with what was happening. He prayed that it was only a bad dream, but knew otherwise. Mendel thought of his blackouts and wondered if this was some bizarre continuation of them. He certainly had no other answer. He suddenly noticed another very curious and unsettling thing. The shades of the dead guards had not entered with him. They drifted beyond the arched gateway as if the winged gargoyle he saw above it kept them at bay. For the first time, Mendel would have liked their company, if only because of their comparative familiarity. Now he was completely alone, facing who knew what. As he started to turn his gaze back, what felt like a hand pushed him deeper into the cemetery, stumbling several steps. Mendel glanced over his shoulder. He immediately swallowed. Naturally, there was no one there. The farmer glanced down at the first of the graves. A crescent-shaped stone marked the spot. The grave had been dug so long ago that it was infested with generations of weeds and grass, and had even sunken in a bit. Mendel started to look away again, then eyed the marker one more time. Barely legible in the odd gray shadows was the same script that he had seen on the stone near Sarum. Despite himself, Mendel grew fascinated by a revelation. Keeping respectful to the grave, he knelt to the side that leaned over the stone. Up close, Mendel was able to verify what he had seen. Many of the very same symbols ran along the crescent, but in patterns that he did not recognize. Without hesitation, he ran his fingers over the first line. Immediately, he sensed some sort of power emanating from the symbols. Mendel had heard words of power, such as the Mainz clans supposedly used at times, and he could only surmise that these were such. Looking up, Odyssean's brothers surveyed the seemingly endless fields of stone. The graves were marked in a variety of manners, in addition to the crescents. There were star-shaped slabs, squat rectangular ones, and more. Surveying the landscape ahead, Mendel even spotted one overlooking by a towering, winged statue bearing a weapon in one hand. Drawn by that statue, he slipped among the graves in order to get a better look. Fascination replaced dread. He had to learn more. Was this some repository for the dead of the mage clans? If so, did they have some time to what was happening to him? And to Odyssean, for that matter. Until now, he would have doubted it. What little he had gleaned from merchants indicating that the once powerful clans had all but shut themselves off from the world as they continued their arcane duels of wit against one another. They would hardly have the time to bother themselves with a pair of farmers far from the city. Although the statue stood deep in the cemetery, it seemed that Mendel had barely begun toward it when suddenly it loomed over him. He paused, trying to understand what it was supposed to be, a winged being with a face hooded save for glimpses of the mouth and some cascading hair. It wore a robe and breastplate somewhat akin to that of the cathedral inquisitors, but sculpted to resemble some finer material. The breastplate also had script upon it, more words in the same mysterious language. Mendel glanced at the wings again, realized that they were different from those of the birds. What he had taken for feathering looked, when studied closer, more of an artist's rendition of flame. Mendel had never heard legends of any creature or spirit with such wings, not even in the stories his mother had told him when he had been a very young child. In the giant's figure's left hand, it held a great sword whose tip rested on the base beneath the statue. The other hand pointed down, not merely, it seemed to Mendel, indicating the grave beneath, but also those around it. He had the distinct impression that this was supposed to mean something to him, but what, Odyssean's brother could not say. And so, despite his situation, Mendel grew frustrated beyond belief. He was a patient man in general, but someone appeared to be trying, very successfully, to draw him past his limits. "All right, then," he shouted, his voice echoing over and over and over in the silence. "If you want something from me, tell me what it is. Tell me, I demand it!" The moment that he finished, a grating sound filled his ears. Swallowing, Mendel watched in horror as the statue's pointing hand turned enough so that it now indicated that it was what was written on the base. Mendel waited for it to do something else, but the winged guardian froze once more. Slowly, he built up the nerve to look down at what was below. The same ancient script greeted him. He had hardly expected otherwise, but still, this added to his frustration. "But I cannot read it," he muttered. "I do not know what any of it says." Squinting, Mendel attempted to recall the words that had come unbidden to him, that frightening time when the demon had caught him alone in the woods. He remembered the images in his head and the sounds of those words, but they were still not enough to help Mendel with what now lay before him. Weary of the futility of his nightmare, Mendel finally dared lean on the grave as he studied each mark. His mouth formed shapes, but that was all. Nothing, absolutely nothing, made sense. "What does it say?" he growled under his breath. "What does it say?" "The dragon has chosen you." Mendel jerked to his feet. He had heard a voice like that once before back in Sarum. It was akin to the voice of Cyrus. Cyrus, after he had been killed. Part of him wanted to scream for this new one to get out of his head, but another part fixed on what had been said. The dragon has chosen you. He stared at the ancient script and read it anew. The dragon has chosen me. You. The dragon has chosen you. And suddenly, Odyssean's brother could read that line. More important, other symbols now made more sense. Mendel felt that he was now on the verge of discovering the meanings of all of them, and in doing so, discovering the truth about what was happening. But what did the phrase actually relate to? Kneeling close again, Mendel studied the symbol representing the most important word, dragon. A loop twisting into itself, a thing without beginning or end. Mendel knew what a dragon was from legends. Why would this mark represent such a creature? And why such a creature at all? What happened? Mendel quietly asked, then frowned when he noted how he had phrased the question. He had meant to ask, what is happening? Why would he? The dirt beneath his hand suddenly shifted, as if something beneath was seeking to dig its way out. Eyes round, Mendel scrambled back. In doing so, he inadvertently threw himself atop another one of the graves, where, to his further dismay, something also began to stir beneath. Worse, it began to register on him that graves everywhere were shifting, stirring. Mounds of upturned dirt decorated many already, and Mendel's imagination pictured skeletal figures ready to emerge. But just as it seemed that his imagination would become a monstrous reality, there formed in the shadow of the winged statue a figure entirely shrouded in black. Mendel had a momentary glimpse of a face, not unlike his own, in that it was studious in nature, but otherwise very, very different. It had an unreal handsomeness to it, as only a sculptor or a painter could achieve. The figure drew a single symbol in the air, a dagger-like mark, that, for a single blink, flared a bright white. What sounded like a great sigh swept through the cemetery. The graves stilled, the cloaked form vanished, and at that point, Mendel's surroundings changed. He was still in Partha. That much even his jolted mind would have guessed, but Odyssean's brother no longer stood within the cemetery. Instead, Mendel was poised as its gateway. The gargoyle's grinning maw seemed to mock his sanity. The cemetery no longer looked ancient and overrun, but well kept, as one would have expected in Partha. But no matter how hard he squinted, Mendel could see no winged statue. Something touched his shoulder, causing him to yelp like a kicked hound. Strong fingers grasped Mendel and turned him around. To his relief, it was Achilles, not some fiend from the dead. "Mendel, are you all right? What are you doing here?" The hunter looked almost as pale as Odyssean's brother felt. Achilles' eyes darted past Mendel to study the cemetery with utter loathing. "Did you go in there?" No. It seemed best to Mendel not to try to explain, since he himself was not quite certain what had just taken place. A delusion? A dream? Insanity? Instead, Mendel focused on a new and intriguing question. "Achilles, my friend, what are you here? Did you follow me?" This time it was the archer who hesitated before replying with an equally suspicious, "Yes, I did." Achilles gave Mendel a sudden grin, then slapped the farmer on the shoulder. "Don't you want to get lost, Mendel? Town this size, lots of things to distract you, Mendel was not certain whether he was supposed to be insulted by such comments, but chose to ignore them for the sake of both men. Perhaps another time he could share his secrets with Achilles, and the hunter could do the same with him. Those secrets, he believed, all focused on the fateful stone back home. "You need to come back with me, back to the square." Odyssean, it shamed Mendel that he had not been concerned about his brother. Nervously rubbing his hands together, he blurted, "Odyssean, is he all right?" "More than that," he replied Achilles, "but you'll have to see to understand." He happened to look down at Mendel's hands. His brow arched. Your hands are covered in dirt. What? I tripped in the street just before here and had to use my hands to keep from striking the stone with my face, Mendel quickly explained. There was dirt there, he added rather lamely. To his relief and surprise, too. The blonde bowman took his answer at face value. A fall in the street? You're getting too absent-minded for your own good. Here, let's find something to wipe your hands off with and be on our way. With nothing else around, Mendel finally had to brush his hands against his garments. As a farmer, he was used to doing such, but felt a little embarrassed to be seen so in Partha. Yet, they could not very well return to Master Ethan's home first. Mendel dearly wanted to see what was happening in the square. He started to follow Achilles, only to falter but a few steps later. Making certain that his friend was not looking his way, Mendel spun in a quick circle, searching. The ghosts who had been with him since the battle in the wild were nowhere to be found. It was as if that, when the shrouded figure had sent the spirits of the graves to their rest, it had also done the same for the shades of the temple's guards. Thank you, he whispered. Did you say something? Asked the archer, pausing to let him catch up. No, Mendel replied with a vigorous shake of his head. No. Achilles took his answer, as he had the others, for which Odysseus's brother was grateful. Yet, as they hurried along, Mendel's mind stayed with his sibling's situation, but the unsettling, indeed even sinister episode through which he had just suffered. One thing about it haunted him most of all. Not what had happened, not exactly. No. It was a new question that the strange vision had raised, or rather, two new questions bound together. What was the dragon? And why had it chosen him? Despite Achilles' genial appearance, his mood was actually darker than when he had gone off in search of Mendel. The archer had not at all expected to discover Odysseus's brother standing at the very entrance at such a place. It had brought back full-blown, for a second, the horrific sensations that Achilles had suffered after touching the stone. He had tried to cover up his abrupt anguish immediately and was thankful that Mendel had been so preoccupied that he had not noticed. Unfortunately, that preoccupation had drawn the hunter's attention in turn, and was what ate away at Achilles even now. When asked if he had entered the cemetery, Mendel had denied doing such a thing. Yet, Achilles did not have to have a master hunter's honed sense to know that the dirt on the other's hands was not what had been found in the streets. It had a drier consistency, an aged look, and there had been some bits of weed and grass mixed in too. The sort of dirt that would have been more likely found, very easily, in a cemetery. That, in turn, caused Achilles to remember another time back in Sarum, when Brother Achilles had wished to see the grave of the murdered missionary, and had proclaimed to the archer and the others that there had someone been desecrated it. The Master Inquisitor had believed Odysseus somehow responsible, Odysseus, or somewhere near to him. And now here was Mendel at another cemetery with dirt on his hands. Mendel, who had been curiously absent during much of the events in the village. Mendel, who in some ways was beginning to frighten Achilles even more than Odysseus.